So what does the future of cat modelling look like? I think that we will see lots of changes in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm going to focus on my thoughts on the future of 3 aspects of cat modelling. Firstly, what's going to happen to exposure data? Secondly, the availability of models in our future, I think will change, and I'll talk about that. And lastly, I think that the marketplace for cat models is going to look very, very different in the future. And that will be the last topic that I focus on. So let's start with exposure data. In the future, I genuinely believe that we will have solved the long-held industry problem of data formats, and we will all be using a common standard, a common way of representing our exposure data, which makes it very much easier to share information amongst ourselves and between insurers and reinsurers and brokers within the industry. I think we will also be using encryption, which is important because we're already starting to see some sensitivities around sharing information with the increasing protections around privacy, but also the commercial sensitivity around sharing detailed information with your counterparties who may, as well as being investors or reinsurers, may also be competitors in certain levels. So there are sensitivities about sharing data, which I think encryption can help to address. So with standardized data and encrypted data that makes sure that the information is only used for particular purposes, what does that mean? Well, I think that the data that's flowing, the exposure data that's flowing around the industry will be much more dynamic. Today, we have information flows which are characterized by sort of annual processes where large data sets, portfolio data are shared between insurers and reinsurers. I think that in future we will see much more on-demand and dynamic updates of exposure information, and this will make life completely different in terms of the ability to dynamically price portfolios of risk, and also to have a better understanding of what the loss potential is in a post-event response mode, because we'll have much more up-to-date information to look at rather than data which could be as much as a year out of date. Lastly, on the exposure side, I believe that we will have, as well as standardized, possibly encrypted and more dynamic flows of information, I think we'll have much more enriched data. So in addition to the information provided and flowing across the chain from the original insured through the brokers and the direct insurers through to reinsurers, I think that there'll be increasingly opportunities to enrich the data that's collected. We see a trend where fewer questions are being asked of policyholders in order to bind the risk in the instance, but additional information can be appended and attached from third-party data sources. So I think that's a trend that we will see continuing, and ultimately, as the takers of risk, we will have more information about the original risks than in the future than we currently have today. So what does the future look like for models themselves? Well, I think with an open platform widely used in the industry, the barriers to entry for new producers of models is massively reduced. It's will be a lot more straightforward to find a marketplace for new model offerings, and I think that we'll see a much richer array of different suppliers of models in the future. Also, the kind of questions that we need to answer as an industry are changing. Climate change is going to loom larger, and the level of scrutiny on organizations' preparedness for climate change is only increasing. Already we're starting to see more and more risk assessment questionnaires and surveys by regulators around the world, but also from rating agencies and other stakeholders. So I can imagine increasingly we will have versions of models which are forward-looking in terms of the way that they've been parameterized. And I think that in order to allow us to have a number of different sensitivities in terms of the way that the models are constructed to represent the future climate, I think that they'll increasingly we'll start to see people using smaller catalogues of events, because it's not necessarily helpful to have 100,000 years representing, you know, a future 30 years in 30 years time. Maybe it would be better to have, you know, 100 different 1,000 year catalogues representing some of the sensitivities and uncertainties in terms of what the future might look like. So that's one possible way that we may use models differently in order to properly reveal the uncertainties, which is useful not only for understanding the possible future risk landscape, but also it's also a way of understanding the uncertainties inherent in the way that we parameterize for the current risk landscape. So we talked about exposure data and talked about the availability of models underpinned by an open platform. The last theme I wanted to talk about was the marketplace for catastrophe models. Now, I think with an open platform and with a much increased supply of models and an increased number of potential sources of where do you go to get your models, I see that the cost of actually licensing or accessing models will come down quite dramatically. What does this mean? Well, I think it means that the marketplace for models will grow. So far to date, historically, the marketplace for cat models has very much been confined to the insurance industry, and within the insurance industry, it's typically the large brokers, global reinsurance companies, and some of the larger global reinsurance groups have been the ones spending, you know, multi-million-dollar licenses to access cat models. In future, I think as the cost to access models comes down, because there's a much wider set of suppliers, I think that the marketplace will grow in the sense that increasingly cat modeling will be a tool used by insurers, not just the large insurers, but even small insurance companies, and cover holders, MGAs will increasingly use cat models to support their risk selection and portfolio management. Beyond the insurance industry, there are a whole bunch of other potential customers which I think we're likely to see more take up or are adapted for other purposes. And I talked about forward-looking models and models that help us to understand the potential risks, not just of today, but in terms of forward-looking from a climate change perspective. And that will appeal and be useful to a whole new set of stakeholders. So, for example, investors and holders of real estate portfolios will be very interested in understanding the potential risks associated with climate change through the lens of forward-looking models. Similarly, I think we'll see large corporates, risk-managed large corporations could themselves be users of models. If we start to see more modeling as a service, I think that's another potential customer. And through the work that starting with the Insurance Development Forum, there is likely to be an increasing take-up of sovereign and sub-sovereign risk transfer, and that I think that there are a number of countries around the world who are particularly vulnerable to rising sea levels or have a particular vulnerability to climate change in a warming world, and it would not surprise me at all if the use of catastrophe models is much more deeply embedded in the way that country risk managers, as part of government, or cities, mayors' offices in various cities around the world will increasingly start to examine and try to manage and plan for climate change using quantitative tools like catastrophe models. So, I think with all of these potential new customers, it's clear that there could be a very, very vibrant and competitive vibrant and competitive marketplace for catastrophe models in the future that extends way beyond the relatively limited and compact use cases that we have in the insurance industry, which I think will be a good thing for society as a whole, to help allocate capital and direct our resources as we rise to the challenges of protecting society of the future.